White Rock kids, you can be dismissed to your class. Go hunt out Teddy. Give him a big hug for me. Everybody. Well, good morning. My name is Tim Hawkins, and I am one of the pastoral residents here at White Rock, and I'm also the student ministries pastor for our youth and for our high school students. If you don't know me, I'm Tim, and I want to share a little bit about myself with you. That way we can connect a little bit. I'm a naturally reflective person. It is both a gift and a curse. It's a gift because about 10 years ago, I believed in Jesus, and my life began to make big changes. And I look back to about that time, and I think about all the things that I went through. Good choices, good times, bad times. And when I reflect upon them, I think, Lord, you have brought me through so much to where I am today. I'm so encouraged by that, and I trust that God will continue to be faithful. Being reflective is a curse because I'm a daydreamer. And everybody knows that daydreaming is simply a waste of time. There is no production that occurs in daydreaming. You just daydream. And so that's part of the issue. But that's not unique. Some of you in here probably would sit and say, Tim, I can relate with you on that. I daydream too. I reflect. It's all good. I tend to do reflection when I'm listening to soundtrack music. Anybody? It's kind of like on my second date with my wife. We went to Baskin-Robbins. She gets birthday cake ice cream, which was new to me at that time. I thought that was crazy. Birthday cake and ice cream, what is that? And then she hears my order. I'd like strawberry ice cream with Reese's peanut butter cups. And the two just go together. And the same for me is with reflection and with soundtrack music. Specifically, if my wife ever sees me listening to music, more than likely she gets it right to say, Tim, you're listening to Lord of the Rings again, aren't you? Yes, I can't help it. I love the fact that you know it's a predictable outcome, but the music is what makes the movie so fantastic. And as a matter of fact, all the movies I like, every single movie that I would sit here and argue for that you should see, are all because of the music. If the music is not a part of the movie, I don't care. Not worth my time. It's the music, though. And the reason why the music to me is so important is because at the very conclusion of the movie, you ask the question, how did they do that? Or posed different ways, how did it come to that? How did that happen? And I'm not a very smart guy, but I think y'all are much smarter than me, so you probably already realize this, but the conclusion of a movie, the end of it, is predicated upon things that happened earlier, right? So the very end of the movie is a result of things that happened earlier. It amazes me sometimes. But you know, at the end of every movie, at the end of every good movie, let me caveat that real quick, that something in the beginning or the middle of the movie has happened. It's a pivotal point that answers to the question, how did it come to that? For example, Forrest Gump. I love Forrest Gump. The end of the movie, Forrest is sitting on a bench and he's opened up this book that he uses at the beginning of the movie to put a little feather in. At the end of the movie, he opens it up and the feather flutters away and this beautiful music is playing. And you know from this story that Forrest Gump, at the very conclusion of the movie, is a millionaire, he's got a son, he's very fulfilled in his life, even though his love Jenny has died. And if you see the rest of the movie prior to that, you go, dude, I would never have guessed you to have an outcome like that. And yet, I look at Forrest Gump and the whole story, and I think, how did it come to that? You're kind of a socially awkward dude. How does it come to this moment at the very end when nobody would have expected this of you? Well, it all goes back to a particular point. See, Forrest is young, about 10 years old, and he and Jenny are walking down the dirt road together. Some punk kids roll up behind him on the bike. They're little bullies. They start chucking rocks at him, peg him in the head. And because Forrest is kind of socially awkward and he doesn't pick up on social cues, nor does he pick up on like cue balls to the head, he just stands there and takes it. And Jenny's the voice of reason for him. Everybody knows what Jenny says. Run, Forrest, run. And what I love about the scene is that the movie slows down at this particular point. The music is so beautifully played. It's the kind of music I wish I was listening to when I want to go work out. Not when I'm working out, when I want to go work out. I need the extra motivation, the push. The music is beautiful. And in the scene, Forrest turns to run. And if you know anything about Forrest, his life has been defined by the braces that have been attached to his legs to correct a back issue. So as he turns to run, he kind of does this little peg leg motion. And then suddenly it slows down, and you see him bring his knees up for the first time as his quadriceps engage and pull his knees up higher. And then suddenly the braces that have defined his life are shattered into pieces, and Forrest takes off down the road. so quickly that the kids on the bike can't even keep up to him. And from this point, the rest of the story plays out. Forrest gets a football scholarship to play at the University of Alabama. Then he becomes an All-American. Then he graduates college, something that's kind of, whoa, that's crazy. Never would have thought about that for you. Not only that, he joins the army, fights in Vietnam, runs back into the forest during a battle, saves several comrades, receives the Medal of Honor. Then, after Jenny leaves him towards the end of the movie, Forrest decides, I'm going to go running. And he runs coast to coast. And everything that you see play out comes back to this one moment in his life. And for you and I, if we sit and take just a quick moment and ask the question, how did I do that? You can look back to a point in time where something changed for you. It was pivotal. From my life, I have an example. So Kayla and I were dating, and I was the first one to use the L word, and Kayla wasn't really feeling it yet. I used the L word because I was like, hey, I want to marry this girl. Kayla didn't use the L word yet because she just couldn't reciprocate that feeling and that desire. One night, I'm working overnight at a homeless shelter, and my girlfriend comes, and she visits me. So Kayla comes and visits me, and I think this is the most astounding thing ever because it's at a homeless shelter at night, and she braves it all to come and see me. She had full intention that night to break up with me. She had written a letter that she was going to read, and she was going to break up with me, all because she desired that I be with somebody who could reciprocate the same feelings. Well, I told her that night that, hey, I just want to let you know, I feel so blessed and so lucky to have a girlfriend who would come and visit me, especially at this kind of place at this time of night. And Kayla has a change of heart. She actually runs into the bathroom down the hallway, has the letter kind of in her hoodie pocket. She takes the letter out, stuffs it down the back of her pants because she knows Tim ain't going to check there for the thing, comes back into my office, and then we just pick up where we left off. And I didn't hear about this story until we were engaged. But I come to find out that Kayla had all power and really a lot of reason to say we're done. And yet here I stand today with a beautiful wife, a godly woman, an adorable son. I think my 7-month-old boy is the most adorable boy ever. And you might say, well, Tim, you're biased. And I'd say, yes, I am. And I have the microphone, so you have to hear it. But here I am today. And I look back to a moment that changed everything. And I didn't even have control. Fellas, real quick, you might think that it was you who really got the ball rolling on this whole, my wife really wanted to marry me thing. It was all in your wife's hands the entire time. Just you married up, okay? Always remember that. You outpunted your coverage and you got lucky on the tackle. That's how it rolls. Now, my story is unique, but some of you have stories similar to that where you sit and go, how did I do that? Last week, some of you went and shared the gospel with people, and you never would have considered it. As a matter of fact, I heard stories of people trying to figure out, okay, what can I not do and what can't I do? And are there guidelines? Do I have to do that? Can I just sit back and listen? Can I just kind of watch it all take place? And I'm hearing stories from people who never expected they'd go and share the gospel. And what happened? That they would come to the end of that day last Sunday, and they went forward with it. Well, it's probably because Kyle came in and gave an empowering message and you felt encouraged to do so, and we broke camp and you went out and did that thing. But what about the people who come out of debt? They look at their life, they've been in debt for thousands of dollars, and they go, how did I come out of debt? More than likely than not, they made a decision one day where they said, I'm going to stop spending above my means. I'm going to create a budget, and then I'm going to stick to it because I don't want to be enslaved to debt. Or for those people who lost hundreds of pounds, you hear those stories all the time. What changed for them? There was a moment where during all the temptation that they'd been dealing with to continue down that road, they decided no more. Or forgiveness. How did they ever forgive that person? How did that couple ever reconcile after that whole thing? There is something you can go back to, and you see it play out down the road. And the reason why answering the how question is so important is because it helps us to have the opportunity for something called repeatable outcomes. Repeatable outcomes are, across the board, something that all of us desire. We all desire repeatable outcomes because we are creatures who desire consistency. We are creatures who desire consistency in our life. And this is what I mean. Something good happens, you evaluate it real quick, and you go, oh, that's what led me to here. I want to keep doing this. Even if you're 100% spontaneous, you still desire to be consistent, even in your spontaneity. And what I find so unique about our desire for consistency is that for those people who are the most consistent in their life, they say one thing and they do another, they can always draw it back to something that they figured out helped them in the end result. And as Christians, I find that this desire for consistency is no more important in any other regard than when it comes to temptation to sin. You and I face temptation all the time, internal, external, all the time. And yet we need to have a consistent outcome when it comes to temptation. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But here's the thing. Whenever you come across a situation that deals with your faith, let me tell you this. The best place to go and look first is to see how Jesus dealt with it. And we've been going through the Gospel of Luke for some time. And so we're going to pick back up in Luke, and we're going to see exactly how Jesus deals with this whole idea of temptation. And to do so, we're going to keep the theme. We're going to go to the very end of my message today, and we're going to answer the question, how did Jesus do that? It's Friday morning of Holy Week. Jesus is standing before the Roman governor Pilate, condemned to death. In but a few several hours, he will hang upon a cross. How did it come to that? Well, the night before, a few things happen. It's kind of a blur almost. It's just so much. Jesus is betrayed by Judas, one of his disciples. Then in that same tense moment in which Judas and the captors and the guards are coming to arrest Jesus, Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, thinks that it's best for him to take things upon himself and defend Jesus. And so yielding a sword, and apparently the guy has horrible aim, whacks off the ear of a servant of the high priest. If the moment's not tense, it just got even more tense. More so, Jesus picks up the ear, which I find kind of weird. Ears are cute when they're attached to the head, but when they're not attached to the head, it's just kind of weird. Jesus picks up the ear and attaches it, reattaches it to the head of the servant. Whew, that'd be crazy. But that's not the end of the story for that night. Jesus is arrested. He's brought to trial illegally. See, in Judaism, you can't have a trial at night. Not only that, the religious leaders of Judaism, of the people then, the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel, they wanted to bring Jesus up on capital charges. And there was a rule. The day before a major Jewish festival, you cannot do that. So this whole thing was illegal all from the get-go. But yet they go through with it. During that trial, Jesus sees who he believes one of his closest disciples deny him 3 times. The same guy who chopped off the ear with great zeal is the same guy who just hours earlier told Jesus, I will never deny you. I will never walk away from you. I would die for you. And yet Jesus is gazing at Peter as he's hearing the rooster crow after his 3rd denial. And then Jesus is blindfolded, mocked, and beaten. And this is where we pick up in our story in Luke. You can open your Bibles to Luke chapter 23. So that was Thursday night, and now we're coming to Friday morning. And this is what Luke tells us. They began to accuse Jesus, they being the religious leaders. They began to accuse Jesus in front of Pilate, and this is what they say. We found this man subverting our nation, or misleading our nation, or disturbing the peace, forbidding us to pay the tribute tax to Caesar, which Jesus did not do. Jesus told them when asked, hey, should we give taxes to Caesar? Jesus says, you give to Caesar what is Caesar's. You give to God what is God's. Not once in that statement do you hear Jesus say, no, don't pay it. And then they also say this, and claiming that he himself is the Christ, a king. And Pilate's hearing this, and Pilate is a Roman governor, and Pilate has a twofold job. Collect the taxes, keep the peace. And to hear that Jesus is possibly claiming himself to be a king, his ears perk up. Because he needs to figure out, all right, if this is a real deal, we can't have this going on. And the term Christ, which if you're not familiar with this, we usually call Jesus Christ. Christ isn't really Jesus' last name, but if that's how you need to remember it, that's all good. Christ is another term for Messiah, or what it actually means is anointed one. The Apostle Paul in all of his letters would call Jesus Christ, Jesus the anointed one of God, the one who is to come and take away the sin of the world, the Savior. And so Pilate asks Jesus at hearing this, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And I got to appreciate Jesus' answer. Man, he knows how to answer but not answer. He says, "You say so." And what Jesus really means here is, I am. But you have no idea what that means. Pilate turns to the chief priests and to the crowds, and this is what he says: "I find no basis for an accusation against this man. In other words, I find him innocent." But they, the Jewish leaders, persisted in saying, "He incites the people by teaching throughout all Judea. It started in Galilee, and it's ended up here." And again, Pilate hears something that would have perked his ears. He hears Galilee. Now, Galilee during this time was a province where it wasn't uncommon for seditious activity to take place. But Jesus wasn't seditious. But what Pilate hears is, hey, he's from Galilee. One of my compatriots is in town, another Roman governor, and he has jurisdiction over Galilee. I think I could possibly just kind of wash my hands of this, send Jesus off to this other governor, and let him handle it. And so Luke tells us that Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, and Herod is overseeing the jurisdiction of Galilee. Now, what we're not going to talk about here is that Herod loves the fact that Jesus is coming to him, because Herod wants to see a miraculous sign performed. He just wants to be entertained. So Luke tells us Herod questioned Jesus at considerable length, but Jesus gave no answer. Little background on Herod. This is the same Herod who chopped off the head of John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin. So between the fact that Herod only wants to see a sign and the fact that he chopped off the head of Jesus' cousin, I'm not surprised that Jesus doesn't answer. But yet Jesus, being questioned by two different governors, two rulers of Rome who have the power to condemn him, he doesn't defend himself. Nonetheless, Luke continues. The chief priests and the experts in the law were there, vehemently accusing him with all emotion that they could muster. They, the religious leaders, are driving events towards the cross as passionately as they can. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then dressing him in elegant clothes, royal regalia, as a mockery, Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate. And then I love this little part that Luke puts in here. And that very day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Aww. Jesus brought you two together. That's cute. Pilate, upon receiving Jesus back into his jurisdiction and his, in essence, trial, he calls back the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and he says to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. When I examined him before you, I did not find this man guilty of anything you accused him of doing. I find him innocent. He is not a problem to Rome. And everything that you have said he has done, I find no evidence to indict him." Not only I, but so did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Not only do I find Jesus innocent, but I sent him to Herod just to do a cross-reference on this whole situation. Herod finds him innocent as well. Look, he has done nothing deserving death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him. And this flogging that would have taken place, don't think of the Passion of the Christ movie. The flogging here is kind of like a slap on the wrist. It's the idea of, hey, I'm going to cause you some pain and some suffering so that you remember never to be a disturbance to the peace of Rome. The flogging that Jesus gets before the crucifixion, completely different. Pilate's whole intention here is to release Jesus. But the religious leaders are there, and they're not going to be let off very easy. They scream out to Pilate, "Take this man away." In other words, what they're saying is, take him away and kill him. Release Barabbas for us. During this time of the Passover, there was a tradition that the Roman government would release one prisoner upon request of the religious leaders. And so they asked that Barabbas be released and that Jesus be taken away and killed. And this is what Luke tells us. He gives us a little parenthetical note, and he says, this was a man, Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for stealing candy from a baby and kicking a goat. That's horrible. It's just horrible. Hopefully you all know that is not true. If you don't, I'm going to fix it. I just want to make sure you guys are awake. Now, this is what Luke really tells us. This was a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and murder. Ironically, the very thing that Jesus is being condemned for, which is misleading and disturbing the peace, Barabbas had actually done that. Not only that, but he had taken a life. Barabbas was in prison, condemned to death. Pilate addressed them once again because he wanted to release Jesus. Why? Because Pilate found Jesus innocent. It's the theme over and over again. But the religious leaders kept on shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" And I've got to imagine that Pilate's sitting here going, "You've got to be kidding me. Do you know what crucifixion is?" I mean, we as Romans have perfected the art form of crucifixion. Do you not know that Jesus will hang on a cross for several days until he gives way because of lack of strength, and he'll collapse down on himself, so much so that his lungs will begin to be crushed and he will asphyxiate and suffocate to death? Do you not realize what you're asking? And yet they cry out, "Crucify, crucify him." And for a third time, Pilate says, "Why? What wrong has he done? I have found him guilty of no crime deserving death. I will therefore flog him and release him." But they were insistent, demanding with loud shouts that he be crucified. And then Luke very simply puts, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he handed Jesus over to their will. The battle of wills between Pilate and the people come to a climactic point when Pilate, as a Roman governor, has to choose one man's life over the peace of the city. He's held accountable for whether there's a riot. But one man's death, that could save his skin. It seems like the better outcome. Even though Pilate believed Jesus was innocent, even though Pilate's wife, which in another gospel, we find that Pilate's wife encourages him to release Jesus, even though the evidence is insurmountable that Jesus is innocent, what we come to realize here is that declared innocent, Jesus takes the place of the guilty. On a very microcosmic scale, we see something take place right here, which will be exponentially greater when Jesus is on the cross. How did it come to this? How is it that Jesus goes throughout all of these proceedings, knowing very well himself that the illegal trials are taking place, knowing very well what lies ahead of him, that it's the cross and suffering and pain and death? How does he not defend himself? How does he simply stand before the leaders and allow it to happen? How? How does he do it with such fear, or with such bravery and confidence, seemingly lacking fear? How? Well, if we've learned anything, the conclusion is predicated upon something that has happened earlier. The night before, right before Jesus is betrayed and captured, Luke records an experience that Jesus has with his disciples. And this is what Luke tells us. It says, "Then Jesus went out and made his way, as he customarily did, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him." If you know where we're at in the story, Jesus has been in the upper room with his disciples. He's established this new covenant. We know it as the Lord's Supper. He breaks the bread. He gives the juice. He says, "This is my body that will be broken for you. This is my blood that's shed for you for the forgiveness of sins." So they're all up there together. And then after it's all said and done, Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus did this all the time. He would separate himself and go away and pray. And this particular time, his disciples have followed him. Matthew records a little bit more too. Matthew says, he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John. These are the two brothers who are arguing over who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. Three of Jesus' closest disciples. He takes a little bit further into the garden. And then it says, "And Jesus became anguished and distressed. Then he said to them, 'My soul is deeply grieved, even to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake with me.'" They have not, up to this point in their time with Jesus, seen him like this. They have not seen Jesus in this kind of anguish. If you've ever been around somebody who's a pretty even keel, consistent person, and you suddenly see them a little bit unraveled, or possibly with fear maybe anxiety. If you've ever seen that, you're like, this is kind of weird, man. This is different. I've never seen you like this. This is a little bit causing me some angst too. You have to imagine that the disciples are looking at Jesus, who is plainly and physically distressed, and they're sitting here going, what's going on? And then Jesus, with all this anguish, all this pain, even to the point of death, he tells them something. He says, pray that you will not fall into temptation. A better way to put this is to pray that you will not enter into temptation. You see, just a little while ago, guys, I told you that you are going to be tempted to defect. Satan is going to come, and he's going to do whatever means possible to get you to walk away from me, to leave this following. Pray that you will not enter into that temptation. And then Luke says this, Jesus went away from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and he prayed. He tells the disciples to pray, and then he himself goes and practices what he preaches. And in Jesus' pain and in his anguish, anticipation of the cross to come, this is what he prays. Father God, if you are willing, take this cup away from me. We are on very holy ground here, where Jesus' human nature is at conflict, is at a struggle with the will of God for his life. You and I have been there. Christians, we have had moments where the temptation is so great that you know, if anything, you're sitting here going, is there another way to do this? Is there another way to go about accomplishing this thing? For Jesus, no, it was the cross. And yet you see Jesus going, Father, if there is any way that we can do this, please let it happen. And then I love this. With all the fear, all the pain, all the anguish, Jesus' very next line in his prayer is something that I hope resonates and is etched into our hearts for the remainder of our lives. Yet, not my will, but your will be done. Yet, Father, even though I have all this pain and I'm afraid of what's coming, because it's okay to be afraid. Fear is not a sin. Fear is a temptation to not do what you're supposed to do. Even with all that, yet not my will, Father, but your will be done. At the moment of Jesus' anguish, he recommits himself, which he never really lost. But he says, Father, I'm going to fulfill your will for my life. And it's like God answers his prayer. God answers prayers. I believe in that. Sometimes not in the ways we want, but in this particular case, it's interesting how God answers his prayer. Luke says, then an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And in the Greek, the word strengthened is a connotation of physical strength. That Jesus is physically strengthened by the angel. Why? What for? Is it to go and fight the battle? Is it to go and stand before Pilate? Is it to go and face the Sanhedrin, be slapped around and be able to take it? No, Luke tells us that at the moment that Jesus is physically strengthened by the angel, he does something that I think is just totally backwards to what we would do. And in his anguish, Jesus prayed more earnestly, as his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Jesus, who has had his answer to prayer in physical strength renewed, doesn't stand up and go to face the enemy. He prays even more so. His anguish and his pain and his distress have not been alleviated. Yet, renewed in strength, he prays. And then he gets up from the prayer, he comes to the disciples, and he finds them sleeping. And I got to give the disciples some credit here. They're exhausted from grief. They've seen Jesus in a way they've never experienced before. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to say that they were having serious issues or that they weren't believing in Jesus or they didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. They were exhausted from grief. I'm going to leave it at that. But listen to what Jesus says again. So he said to them, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you will not fall into temptation. Guys, I realize you're tired. And I realize that you have no idea what's going on and that you're in just as much confusion and angst as I am. But you cannot enter into the temptation that is about to come upon you. You must pray. You see, what I think Luke wants us to realize is that the reason Jesus can stand before Pilate, condemned to death, and it almost seems like, man, he's just a man's man. He just is going to take it straight on. Not the case. I think the reason why Jesus was able to do that is because in his greatest moment of temptation, he prayed. In Jesus' greatest moment of temptation, when his flesh is desiring to do whatever else is necessary to accomplish the same goal as the cross, yet not go to the cross, he prays. And he is strengthened and he prays. And he does the Father's will. And I think what Luke wants his readers and wants us to realize today is if we're desiring to be creatures of consistency, our greatest response to a life consistently influenced by temptation, whether it's internal or external, is to consistently respond in prayer, to be people of prayer, to not say, I'm going to do this by my own volition, by my own strength. Yeah, I know the temptation is strong, but come on, I'm in the Western world. I'm independent. I don't need anybody else's help. I can do this. And yet you know time and time again that the world around us sees Christians as hypocrites. Why? Because they see us and they hear us and they watch us say and do one thing, yet they don't realize that we are tempted beyond sometimes the point that we can handle. All they see is that you say and do one thing, and then you do something completely else. Yet we know that's not the case. We know that when we say and do one thing, hopefully to obey the Lord our God, that we then go through a process of temptation, and sometimes serious temptation, that we enter into and we fail. The world doesn't recognize that, but we know that's true. And yet I believe the world is asking for people to be Jesus-like, to engage with them, who are willing to say, yes, the Christian life is the greatest life that you can possibly have, but it is not the easiest one. It is the one that I find most abundantly is provided for in the moments of temptation, in the moments when you know right and wrong. See, the Christian testimony is so important because if you give into temptation, you hurt your personal testimony, you hurt your relational testimony, and you hurt the apologetics, the defense of the gospel. When you enter into sin, you and I have personal consequences. Don't need to go into them. You know them. Shame, guilt, isolation. Relationally speaking, no sin goes unrelated to somebody else. You sin, it affects everybody else in your life, even if they're not a part of it. And then not only that, when you enter into sin, you hurt the gospel, the message that is proclaimed to the world, that Jesus was sent by God to die on a cross, and that faith alone in him is what saves you. Temptation is a serious thing, yet it is not called for us to approach temptation on our own. And I think if we're looking at the story of Jesus, why he can approach Pilate with almost an undaunting kind of confidence, I don't think it's anything necessarily miraculous. I think it's that Jesus knows, not my will, but your will be done. I have just a couple minutes and I want to say one thing. Can we imagine for a moment, think through some of the things that we've done and the consequences that came from them. Can we think about what it would have looked like for us to approach that moment of temptation, that choice, that climactic moment, and instead of just trying to do it on our own, if we would but submit ourselves, posture ourselves before God with a heart that says, your will be done. You want to know why I think Jesus was able to go forward with the crucifixion? Because he had said yes to God long before the question was ever asked of him. The way in which we as Christians, and for you non-Christians here, I want you to know something too. The way in which we as Christians are to live our lives is in a fellowship of prayer with our God so that we realize it's not by our own doing. You have the Spirit of God living inside of you. And God has a desire for your life, not to enter into temptation, but to submit yourself and pray. And pray specifically this: not my will, but your will be done. We're about to take communion. And I find no better transition into this time than for each of us who are here, who are believers in Jesus Christ, to recommit ourselves to that very thing. Not my will, God, but your will be done for my life. If it's difficult, your will. If it's easy, your will. If it doesn't make sense, your will. If it's going to cause me personal sacrifice, your will be done. Ushers, if you would come forward, take a moment. Come before your God and say that very thing. Not my will, but your will be done.